Okay, so here's a quick demonstration showing you how to create a Salesforce.com REST API proxy. So instead of exposing your REST API from your existing Salesforce instance, create an API endpoint, a proxy endpoint that exposes this endpoint out to your consumers, your applications, your partners, your different systems, and have them go through the proxy before they can actually hit your Salesforce instance. The benefit of this, of course, is that you can apply API policies to kind of control and enforce rate limiting and throttling to ensure that you don't hit those Salesforce limitations. Additionally, you also have analytics that allow you to have a better understanding of how APIs are being used within your organization. Okay, so let's go ahead and switch over to the platform and kind of show you how that's working. So again, the idea here is that Salesforce does have its own REST APIs, but if you want to kind of enforce the usage of those APIs today, you have to. There's no way to do that programmatically within Salesforce, right? Because they do have limitations on the number of times you can make calls. But the idea here with this demonstration is to show you how easy it is to set up the endpoint platform and the API manager to control access to these underlying APIs. Okay, so what I have here is a Salesforce developer account. I have an account record in here that I want to expose out. From the Salesforce side, of course, the first thing that you'll need to do is go ahead and set up an application, right, to allow the caller to call into that REST API to grab data. That way they have to use OAuth authentication to grab the data. So from Salesforce on the within the setup page, you'll go ahead and under build, under create, go to apps, and you'll create a new connected app. So in here I have an app already created. It's called Dreamforce app. And in here, you want to make sure that when you create the application, you get the consumer key and the consumer secret, right? You'll need these to actually make the request into the token to generate a authorization token to make a call to the REST API, right? So this is assuming that you've already done this, that you have all this stuff set up today on your Salesforce side, okay? Okay, so from the MuleSoft side, of course, we want to go ahead now and set up a proxied endpoint. So in order to do that, we first need to go into the endpoint exchange. And within the endpoint exchange, we're going to create a new endpoint, right? We're going to go ahead and call this Salesforce Proxy Endpoint API. And for the type, we'll go ahead and select API HTTP, and we'll go ahead and publish that, okay? Once you publish that, you can see that it shows up here under your internal organization. This isn't, of course, exposed out to the outside world unless you want to, but this is the page where you can kind of put in documentation around how the user can authenticate into this API, what you're making available through this specific endpoint. But the idea is that you're adding this entry into the exchange where other users can now go to find out information around this specific proxied endpoint, okay? Okay, so once you set this up with an exchange, the next thing that you want to go into is API Manager. And within the API Manager, this is where you're going to go ahead and set up that specific proxied endpoint now. So in here, we'll go to Manage API from Exchange, and we'll go ahead and search for that specific endpoint. So you can see here Salesforce Proxy Endpoint API. We'll select the version as version 1, the asset version is 1.0, and then for the managing type, we're going to select endpoint with proxy because we're going to want to deploy a Mule runtime that sits on top of the Salesforce API. Okay, and then for the implementation URL, right, this is where we want to actually paste in the specific endpoint that we want to expose. So within Salesforce, you want to have your specific instance, and then the endpoint itself is services/data, right? So if you go to the documentation, they have different examples around making calls to the REST API, right? So if we want to go ahead and get a list of objects, right? So essentially, we want this to be the base of the specific API. So your instance.salesforce.com services data, right? And then the specific version, and then S objects, right? So in here, let's go ahead and copy this, paste this into, paste this into the implementation URL, And additionally, we also want to grab, for example, we'll go ahead and do v37 and then s objects, right? So over here, we'll go ahead and paste that in here. And then the proxy deployment will be Cloud Hub, and then we can go ahead and save. So I've already previously done this. Let's go ahead and switch over there real quick. The Salesforce Proxy Endpoint API, we'll click on the version and we'll pull it up. Now down below, you can see that here, I'm using version 20 for this example, right? But it's still set up for endpoint with a proxy. I'm deploying it to Cloud Hub. And then down below, I'm gonna go ahead and deploy that to a 3.8.x runtime. And then I'm gonna set up that proxy application name. So in this case, I'm gonna go ahead and give it the name nisa-sfdc-proxy.cloudhub.io. And when I deploy this application or this specific application to the runtime manager, it will go ahead and expose that out as a endpoint or a proxied endpoint that now sits on top of my Salesforce instance, right? So now with this proxied endpoint, I can make a request to this endpoint and pass in, the specific resource and, the ID of that resource and get that data by making a REST API call to this proxied endpoint. And the benefit of our platform is that now we incorporate the ability to track that and provide analytics. And then you can also incorporate policies on top of that, right? So if we want to go ahead and apply a policy and say that we want to rate limit the number of requests going into this specific endpoint, we can do so. So we can go ahead and click on make the end user or the consumer can only make 3 requests a minute, okay? So let's go back to the settings here. And then in order to make a call now to this specific endpoint, right? So if we go ahead and click on Manage Proxy in the Cloud, this will bring me to that deployed proxy, right? So here's the endpoint itself, right? And if we try to make a request right now, right, or just a basic request to the browser, it's going to say that my session ID is expired, right? And that's because we need to authenticate through OAuth authentication to the Salesforce token server to actually get a token and then generate the authentication token for that. So best way to do this for example purposes is to leverage something like Postman. So within Postman, what you can do is you can set it up to actually grab the token, right? So in here, we can go ahead and give it the access token URL. So generally it's login.salesforce.com. We're gonna pass in the username, the password, and then we want to get that client ID and client secret, right, from our application that I talked about earlier that we set up within Dreamforce. So you can see here's the client ID and client secret. Within Postman, we can go ahead and paste that client ID and client secret in here, and we can request a token. And it's gonna go ahead and generate that bearer token. So we can go ahead and use that token. And then we want to include this token within the request header, not the actual URL. So once we include that in here, and then you can see here, we've gone ahead and pasted in the proxy to endpoint, right? And then we want to pass in S objects, the account, and then the actual account number, right? So we come back over to my account record here within Salesforce, right? Here is the account ID. We're gonna go ahead and pass this now to the proxied endpoint. We'll click on send, and you can see that it grabs that specific data from that proxied endpoint right now, okay? So now you can see that we've created this proxy. Additionally, we also incorporate our policies, right? So if I make 3 requests within a minute, I'm now gonna exceed that policy that I've put into place. And then additionally, back over on the endpoint platform side, I can actually track those specific calls that are coming into the system, right? We can actually see the number of calls that are being made. If anytime violations have been occurred or it wasn't able to hit a specific endpoint, we can actually track all those specific calls into the system here within our API manager. Okay, so hopefully that answered any questions around setting up, a proxy for the Salesforce REST API. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out.